Flight attendants, what's your NSFW story while on the job? It was a long flight from Seattle to Japan, and in an otherwise empty four-seat row, two single passengers started to hit it off. Within 2 hours, they'd moved closer, sitting side by side, chatting away like old friends. It was clear that sparks were flying. By the third hour, they were still cozied up, now sharing blankets across their laps with their hands hidden underneath. The chemistry was undeniable. At one point, they each got up and went to the bathroom at the back of the plane, just a few minutes apart. When they returned, they slipped back into their seats, leaning into one another like they'd known each other forever. Aw. Eventually, the guy woke up and moved back to his original seat, likely to stretch out and sleep more comfortably. The woman, now alone, looked visibly irritated. While he dozed off, she stayed up watching movies and occasionally stealing glances in his direction, as if waiting for him to return. When the plane landed, it got even more interesting. As the passengers began deplaning, the guy joined a different conga line on the opposite side of the aisle. The woman, now looking flustered, tried to spot him among the crowd, but he had vanished into the sea of travelers. I followed them onto the concourse out of curiosity, purely for science, of course. The woman searched for him, her eyes scanning the terminal, but there was no sign of him. And just like that, he was gone. Story 2. Returning from my deployment in Afghanistan, I had one Ambien left and decided to save it for the long flight home. As we were getting ready to take off, the flight attendants announced that if we wanted food, we needed to leave our tray tables down. Seemed simple enough. I left mine down, popped the Ambien, and passed out right on the tray table. At some point during the flight, I vaguely remember someone shaking me awake. Apparently, it was the flight attendant trying to serve food, but in my half-conscious, drugged-up state, I cursed her out. When I finally came to, the security forces guy sitting next to me was not happy. He immediately started cursing me out, telling me what I'd done. At first, I didn't believe him. It didn't sound like something I'd do. Then I mentioned I'd taken an Ambien, and he immediately understood. I knew I needed to make things right, so I went to find the flight attendant and apologized for my behavior. Thankfully, she was really understanding about it. Lesson learned: don't mix sleep meds with mid-flight wake-up calls. Story 3. I was on a flight out of Korea, or maybe somewhere else. I traveled so much during my time in the military that the exact details blur together, but this particular flight was memorable for all the wrong reasons. There was a guy on board who was getting kicked out of the Army. I don't know if he was on his way to jail or just heading back stateside, but it was clear he wasn't in a good mental state. He was agitated from the start, picking fights with other passengers and causing a scene. Then things escalated. He made a run for the airplane door mid-flight. Absolute chaos. Thankfully, he didn't get very far before the situation was brought under control. After that, my coworker got the unlucky task of sitting next to him for the rest of the flight. He essentially had to babysit the guy to make sure he didn't try anything else. It was a tense flight, to say the least, and one I won't forget anytime soon. Story 4. A while back, I had a wild experience on a flight to Russia. It all started at the airport bar, where I struck up a conversation with an older lady, probably in her 50s, while I was around 23. We shared a few drinks and had a good chat, only to realize we were on the same flight. Things got interesting when she followed me onto the plane and, without hesitation, spoke to the flight attendant in Russian, switching her seat to sit next to me. Already tipsy, she ordered us more wine and offered me some sleeping pills. I foolishly took them, thinking I'd sleep the whole flight. I woke up later, groggy and confused, only to discover I'd sent Snapchats to my buddies showing me making out with this woman. I had no memory of it, and honestly, I'm not sure what else might have happened. I genuinely thought I had just slept through the flight. When we landed, she insisted on buying me dinner during my layover, which I went along with since I was still in a daze. After that, she went her way, and I found a seat at my gate and promptly passed out. That's when disaster struck. There was a last-minute gate change while I was asleep. I woke up to my name being called for the final boarding announcement. Panicked, I ran through the airport, wearing flip-flops and shorts in the freezing February cold, and made it onto the tarmac just in time to board. But the story didn't end there. A few days later, she found me on Facebook and started messaging me constantly, inviting me to vacation in Italy with her. The messages didn't stop, so I eventually had to block her. Moral of the story? Never mix sleeping pills and alcohol on a flight. Lesson learned. Story 5. A flight attendant friend of mine has shared some pretty wild stories over the years, but this one always takes the cake, or maybe the salad. On one flight, she had a passenger who happened to be severely obese. No big deal, just another person going about their travels, right? As she approached him, he politely asked for a seatbelt extender. So far, so normal. But then, out of nowhere, he decided to overshare. "I bet you're wondering how I wipe," he said with a grin. For the record, she was not wondering. Before she could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of salad tongs. "This is how," he declared proudly, giving them a cheerful clack-clack for emphasis. She stood there stunned, unsure how to respond to a man who had just demonstrated his personal hygiene tools mid-flight. While she wasn't judging him for his weight or the creative solution he'd found, she did wonder, why on earth would anyone volunteer this kind of information? Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 6. This isn't my story, but it was told to me by an older woman I met in a pub years ago. She used to work for Aer Lingus back when it first started, mostly handling short-haul flights between Ireland and England. She had a sharp wit and a no-nonsense attitude, which made her stories unforgettable. One day, she told me about the time she was offered a raise to work a few transatlantic flights. On one such flight back from Chicago, a man decided to push his luck. "Some old married fucker kept slapping my arse and calling me honey," she said with a laugh. "I thought to myself, fuck this." Rather than reporting him or enduring the harassment, she decided to handle things her way. She lured the man to the bathroom, pretending to play along. Then, when he least expected it, she feigned pulling down his trousers and punched him square in the balls. She told us she got fired for it, but she didn't seem to have any regrets. "Best day on the job," she said, grinning. She passed away about 4 years ago, but I love sharing her stories whenever I can. Her boldness and humor were one of a kind, and it's my way of keeping her memory alive. Story 7. I was on a nearly empty flight to Paris when a drunk couple boarded and sat a row behind me in the middle section. At first, they seemed very into each other, laughing and getting increasingly handsy as the flight went on. The guy kept ordering champagne and encouraging her to drink. Over time, though, I realized they didn't actually know each other. They had met at the airport. This became clear from their conversations and comments to the flight attendants. He kept trying to get her to fool around or join him in the bathroom, but she was clearly fading, drifting in and out of sleep. When he went to the bathroom, I took the chance to quietly alert the flight attendant. I explained what was happening, that it was disruptive and possibly unsafe for her. The FA acted quickly, intercepting him when he came out of the bathroom looking for her. They moved him to another row and kept an eye on the situation. For the rest of the flight, he kept trying to get her attention, but she ignored him after waking up. I've always wondered what the full story was and whether she would have been okay if they hadn't been separated. Story 8. During my first year flying, I had to handle a medical emergency that I'll never forget. A man in first class had been in the bathroom for an unusually long time. I knocked to check on him, and he assured me he was fine. I told him to press the call light if he needed help. A minute later, the call light went off, and he said he needed a doctor. It turned out he was having trouble urinating due to complications from cancer treatment. We paged for medical assistance, and 3 doctors and nurses on board came to help. We set up a makeshift curtain using blankets for privacy and prepared the urinary catheter from the medical kit. The man was in visible agony, groaning and gasping in pain. As he lay on the floor, I held his hand and head to keep him calm while the medical team worked on inserting the catheter. It was an intense moment, to say the least. And then, mid-procedure, one of the flight attendants in the back, completely unaware of the situation, pulled back the curtain, revealing the man's very exposed and vulnerable state. In a thick southern drawl, she pointed at the oven and casually asked, "Mind if I get my sandwich?" We all froze, stunned. After a moment of silence, she quickly added, "I guess I'll come back in a little bit," and disappeared. It was so absurd that it's funny in hindsight, but at the time, we couldn't believe it. Unfortunately, the catheter didn't work, and the doctors determined he'd need an incision at the hospital. We didn't divert since we were close to landing, but the poor man had to endure the rest of the flight in the bathroom, periodically crying out in pain. After we landed, paramedics rushed him off the plane on a stretcher. Before leaving, he handed me his wife's phone number and asked me to call her to explain what had happened. Looking back, I feel like I should have gotten some recognition, or at least a thank you for helping in such an intense situation. But nope, nothing. Meanwhile, the other flight attendant was still worried about her sandwich. Story 9. My mom worked as a station manager, not a flight attendant, but she still had her fair share of funny and NSFW stories. We lived on an island, so most of the planes were smaller, overwing prop planes, not as tiny as Cessnas, but still small enough to require specific weight and balance calculations. They had a cockpit with a door, but no bathrooms, and most flights were only a handful of passengers. One flight in particular stands out. There was only a couple on board, and halfway through the flight, the pilots radioed in with a strange issue. The plane felt like it was chugging and bouncing, and they were concerned. They were over the ocean and couldn't just land anywhere, so they requested priority to the closest runway. It was a serious situation, and everyone was on edge. A few minutes later, the pilots radioed back, saying everything was fine and they would land as scheduled. When the plane touched down, the couple grabbed their stuff and left quickly, looking pretty uncomfortable. The pilots then told my mom what had happened. Apparently, the couple had been seated in the front row to help balance the plane, but once they were in the air, they decided to move all the way to the back of the plane. The issue? The co-pilot came out to check on the situation and found the man pounding the woman in the back so violently that it was causing the rear of the plane to reverberate and bounce in the air. The pilots were so taken aback, they had to radio back about their concerns mid-flight, but once they figured out what was going on, they decided to just land as planned. After the plane landed, the couple quickly exited, probably hoping no one would ask questions about what had just gone down. Story 10. During COVID, I had a couple of passengers approach me saying, "Hey, I think there's some people going at it in the exit row." My eyes went wide as I tried to process what I just heard. Before I could respond, another person came up and said, "Hey, I think the people in the exit row are going at it." At this point, I immediately sprang into action, ready to break up whatever was going on, when the captain came over the intercom and told us to prepare for moderate to severe turbulence. Everyone immediately sat down and strapped in, and within 30 seconds, we were hit with some incredibly rough air that lasted about 5 minutes. After the turbulence subsided, the captain called again and informed us that we'd be preparing for landing immediately, as the descent was going to be a bit of a roller coaster ride. The cabin lights went bright, flight attendants started collecting trash and doing final safety checks, and by the time I reached the exit row, I was shocked by what I saw. There, sitting in the exit row, were just 2 passengers, an Amish couple, or possibly Mennonites, I'm not sure. There was absolutely no sign of anything inappropriate going on. Guess the appeal of the Mile High Club speaks to everyone, regardless of religious background or way of life. Story 11. During university, I worked as a flight attendant on a charter airline that mainly flew government contracts, transporting either prisoners to a well-known detention center or military personnel. Occasionally, we had more fun charter groups, like the time a company chartered 2 planes to take their staff to the World Cup. I was the head flight attendant on a 757 with a team of 8 attendants on this particular flight. We were transporting a group of 45 military men returning from a mission. One of the attendants was particularly flirty with a few of the men, which wasn't uncommon, but it did catch my attention. Halfway through the flight, I noticed there was a massive queue at one of the AFT lavatories. Since there were other lavatories available, I kept an eye on what was going on before heading back there myself. The line wasn't budging, and when I approached to suggest they use a different one, I was surprised when they all insisted they were fine waiting. Something didn't feel right, so I made another round, and, to my surprise, the same guy was still waiting. At that point, I knocked on the lavatory door. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. There is a way to unlock the door from the outside, so I did just that. What I saw shocked me. The flight attendant, who had been especially flirty, was sitting on the toilet while a passenger stood in front of her with his pants down. It was exactly what you're imagining. To make matters worse, when the passenger left, I noticed she was covered in semen. She looked like she'd taken a dip in a Krispy Kreme glaze bath. That was the moment I learned what bukkake was. As the head flight attendant, I had to report the incident to the captain. I also informed the leader of the group of men. The flight attendant was immediately fired, sat in the bathroom for the rest of the flight, and then sent home on a commercial flight as a passenger. The group of men was given a very stern talking to, and they weren't allowed to leave their seats for the remainder of the flight. The captain thought I was joking at first, but quickly realized I wasn't. He kept asking if I was sure, as if trying to convince himself there had been some kind of mix-up. I asked him, what else could it have been? It was the longest flight of my life after that discovery. The cabin was completely silent, and we spent most of the time in the galleys, still in shock. While it's not uncommon for passengers and flight attendants to hook up or exchange contact information on charter flights, this was something else entirely. Offering sexual pleasure in flight was definitely not part of the job. Story 12. I worked as a flight attendant in Canada for about 9 months. One time, my friend, who was also a flight attendant, and I found ourselves in the same city, but our hotels were about 30 minutes apart. She decided to sleep over at my place. After a couple rounds of hooking up, it was around 1 a.m., and she went to bed. But then, suddenly, I started feeling extremely sick. From about 1 a.m. to 8 a.m., I was stuck on the toilet, throwing up and constantly running to the bathroom. I couldn't move. Meanwhile, she was fast asleep and had no idea what was going on. When she woke up, I was still feeling miserable, and she had to leave for her next flight. I was in no condition to fly, so I had to spend the next 2 days in the hotel room recovering. On the second day, another female flight attendant from my airline came by to check on me. We had a close, flirty relationship, and one thing led to another, and we ended up hooking up as well. I couldn't tell anyone, of course, but those 2 days were an absolutely wild combination of illness and unexpected sex. Story 13. One of my most memorable flying experiences happened on a business flight to Houston a few years ago. I was seated by the window when the woman next to me suddenly lurched for the air sickness bag and started puking. She looked to be in her late 20s or early 30s, and my first thought was to stay cool. Maybe she was pregnant, or perhaps undergoing chemo. It was a fairly short flight, but she spent the entire journey retching, eventually tapering off to dry heaves by the end. I couldn't help but congratulate myself on maintaining empathy and composure throughout the ordeal. As we were getting ready to deplane, she turned to me looking embarrassed and said, "I am so sorry. I got so hammered last night." So much for my well-meaning assumptions and empathy. Story 14. My cousin Walter once had an unforgettable experience on a plane. He was flying to New Mexico when suddenly the hydraulics failed and the plane started spinning out of control. Thinking it was the end, Walter decided to make the most of his final moments. He pulled it out and started, taking care of business right there. To everyone's surprise, the other passengers followed his lead, all doing the same as they plummeted toward what seemed like certain doom. But then, just when things couldn't get worse, snap. The hydraulics kicked back in, the plane righted itself, and it landed safely. When they deboarded, everyone silently tucked themselves back in, as if nothing had happened. It was never spoken of again. A strange bond shared, but never mentioned. Story 15. I was on an overnight flight to Europe from the US during COVID, so the plane was pretty empty. Most of us had our own rows, and it was nighttime, so all the lights were off. I decided to lay across the row, throwing a flannel over my head to hide the fact that I wasn't wearing a mask. Out of nowhere, I wake up to someone touching my leg. I assumed it was a flight attendant waking me up to tell me to put my mask on. But when I look up, I see a guy with a blank expression standing over me. I asked, "What the hell are you doing?" He didn't respond, just stared at me, and then leaned over to touch my thigh. I slapped his hand away. In front of me, there was a girl who was looking between the seats and said he'd tried doing the same thing to her earlier. I asked him again what he was doing, but he just stared. If he had walked away at that point, I probably would have let it go to avoid any problems. But instead, the guy moved up a row and tried to touch the girl again. I don't know what got into me. I'm not usually confrontational, but maybe it was the extra sugar cookie I had at dinner. But I was feeling amped up. I got up, grabbed the guy, and threw him to the ground. Now I'm in the middle of a plane, and I've never really been in a fight. I've seen fight videos, and people usually jump in to break it up, right? But no one did anything. The guy's on the floor, and I'm looking around like, I just threw a grown man on the floor. Isn't anyone going to stop me? The guy gets back up, casually walks towards first class, and disappears into the dark like some shadowy figure I just defeated. I started walking to the back of the plane, trying to figure out what just happened and wondering if I was about to get arrested for being violent on a plane. On the way there, some young guys, maybe 18, were staring at me, shocked, saying, "That dude tried to do that to us too." I won't lie, hearing that and realizing I was the only one who did something about it, I felt like a badass. When I got to the back, I told the flight attendants, "Hey, I just threw a grown man who was touching people to the ground. Aren't you supposed to be stopping me or something?" They calmly said, "That's all right, sir. Have a seat and we'll take care of it." There was no urgency or shock in their response. It was as if I'd told them my tray table wouldn't stay up. So, I sit back down, just waiting for something to happen. Then, one of the flight attendants went to the front of the plane, found the guy, and walked him back to his seat. They sat him down, and the guy just went to sleep. That was it. The woman from the row in front of me thanked me, and all I could think was that this had to be some kind of fever dream. And that's how I met your mother. Just kidding. Yeah, that shit was wild. Story 16. A flight attendant friend once told me about a lineup of planes waiting for takeoff at a major European airport. The holdup was caused by a Lufthansa plane. Apparently, the German pilot was in a heated discussion with the control tower, refusing to proceed because they couldn't account for all the passenger meals they were supposed to have received. Now, as anyone in aviation knows, when flights are delayed like this, all the other pilots in line are tuned into the same radio frequency, listening with growing impatience. After several minutes of back and forth, one of the other pilots, clearly fed up, chimed in anonymously over the radio and asked, "Have you looked in the ovens?" The Lufthansa pilot, however, did not take it as a joke. It was evidently too soon for humor referencing ovens, given Germany's historical sensitivities. Instead of laughing it off, the pilot demanded an official investigation into the source of the comment and insisted the culprit be tracked down and reprimanded. While everyone else on the frequency probably groaned or rolled their eyes, the incident became a memorable story, both for its unintended humor and as a reminder that timing and context is everything. Story 17. My girlfriend works as a passenger service agent, handling boarding and check-ins. She once told me about a flight from Egypt back to Vienna that turned into a total disaster. It was a charter flight, mainly filled with an elderly tour group returning home. Apparently, before the flight, the entire group had their farewell lunch back in Cairo, and everyone ate the same thing. Mid-flight, chaos struck. The pilot called down to ground operations with an urgent message. "We really need more blankets. Bring them straight to the gate." Turns out, more than half the passengers in the group had, well, let's say, a less than pleasant reaction to the meal. Over 75 people on board shat themselves. And with only 4 toilets for about 150 passengers, it was a full-blown disaster. By the time the plane landed, the cabin was an olfactory war zone. The aircraft went straight into deep cleaning mode after that. It wasn't going anywhere again until it had been thoroughly scrubbed down. Story 18. I'm not a flight attendant, but I work in air traffic control, ATC, and during the peak of COVID, I handled a southbound flight from Toronto to Jamaica. Nothing unusual until about 40 minutes later, I saw the exact same flight number on my screen, heading back to Toronto. Curious, I called the controller working that plane and asked what was going on. That's when I got the story. While the flight was over North Carolina, a late teen or early 20s passenger stood up and yelled to the entire plane, "I have COVID." Obviously, chaos ensued. Since the plane was mid-flight over the U.S. and not scheduled to land there, and this was the height of COVID, The US basically said, nope, they're not landing here. So the poor passengers, most likely just hoping for a sunny vacation in Jamaica, had to endure a 5-hour round-trip flight just to land back where they started. When they arrived in Toronto, the guy was arrested, and I imagine he's permanently banned from flying. He claimed it was just a joke, but either way, I couldn't help but feel terrible for the other passengers. What a nightmare. Story 19. I vividly remember a turbulent flight with my 2 children. My 3-year-old son was perfectly fine, happily strapped into his seat, but his infant sister urgently needed a diaper change. I made sure my son was buckled in and safe, grabbed the diaper bag, and headed to the bathroom with my daughter. The changing table folded down over the toilet, and let me tell you, in that tiny room, I had to plant my feet and brace my elbows to stay upright as the plane jostled us around. Meanwhile, my daughter thought the turbulence was hilarious. She was giggling and having a great time as the changing table bounced up and down. As I was mid-change, the flight attendant started banging on the door, insisting I return to my seat because of the turbulence. Calmly but firmly, I told her, "Trust me, nobody on this plane will thank me if I don't finish this diaper change." Despite the bumpy ride, I managed to wipe my daughter clean, secure a fresh diaper, and even wash my hands before the flight attendant finally forced the door open. I thanked her with as much grace as I could muster, then bounced back to my seat, triumphant. Lesson learned: turbulence is nothing compared to the disaster of a soiled diaper on a packed flight.